Good day, students. We'll call this discussion the first part of our discussion on fascism. We'll call this recording the first part of our discussion on fascism. We'll do a definition of fascism. We'll talk about some of the fascist leaders of world history. All right, so according to the fascist, or as we'll say in the mind of the fascist, modern society has gone wrong. The fascist sees the moral decline of society. They look at their leaders and they see the lack of resolve to solve the problems that harm the state. The fascist sees the economic disorder and the attendant suffering, and the fascist resolves to cure society. The fascist rejects the liberal notions of individual freedoms. The fascist blames the conservative for the inequalities of economic life. And the fascist blames, and as we'll see in the German experiment, the fascists will put communists and socialists into early concentration camps because the fascist sees the communists and the socialists as responsible for the moral decline of the state. In the words of the Italian fascist, El Duce Benito Mussolini, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. I call your attention to the first concentration camps of the 20th century. Yes, the Germans put socialists in concentration camps. Yes, as we'll see in a second, the Nazis put the Jews into concentration camps. But the first concentration camps of the 20th century were located in what is now called Namibia. Between 1904 and 1908, the German colonialists waged a genocidal war against the Herero and the Namaqua people, killing up to 100,000 of them. In 1904, the Herero people rebelled against German occupation, and this rebellion of the Africans was brutally suppressed by the Germans. The 15,000 Herero and Namaqua people, people, mainly women and children and very few men, though the remaining 15,000 who survived, they were gathered by the Germans and led into concentration camps. One of those concentration camps was called Shark Island. There, the prisoners were forced into hard labor as slaves for German businesses. They were given some rice for their efforts, but nothing more, and many died as a result of the hard, exhaustive work and the poor diet. In 1918, British authorities had admitted that up to 74% of the Herero and the Nama people died within German concentration camps. Most of the dead were women and children. Remember that Hitler comes into power in 1933. So this is 25 years before the Nazi regime. Now, to document the crimes of the early fascists, I call your attention to the Jewish Holocaust. When Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, his state begins construction of a network of concentration camps. And between 1941 and 1945, through the end of World War II, approximately 6 million Jews are rounded up by paramilitary death squads, put into these camps with famous names like Treblinka and Auschwitz, and they were subject to a policy called extermination through work. They were put into gas chambers. They were subjected to mass shootings. Now, let's do some definition work. Fascism is an eco-political society which holds that the state totally controls that society and the means of production are controlled by private corporations. Remember, when we went through socialism as an ideology, we said that the means of production are going to be controlled by the state. But remember, the state, and under socialists, the state is controlled by the people, the famous phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, under the fascist state, the state is controlled by, the the means of production is controlled by private corporations. Now, as opposed to liberalism, conservatism, and Marxism, the fascists understand society a bit differently. Remember, the liberal is criticized by the fascist as being guilty of bringing about economic depressions. Remember, the conservative, according to the fascist, the conservative is seen as weak, and the fascist says that the Marxist has a decline in morals. We see from examples of fascism from Mussolini and Francisco Franco that they are anti-socialist, they are anti-communist. However, we also see a definite lack of theoretical unity around from fascists around the world, right? So worldwide, fascists held different beliefs, different political ideologies, different ways of managing the state. So how do we get to understand what a fascist is if they lack theoretical unity? Well, by looking at their actions, we can come to a definition of their ideology. And by understanding their environment, we can understand their actions. We'll do that, some of that work. Now let's get to know some of the world's famous fascists. Let's start with Benito Mussolini. From 1922 to 1943, Mussolini is Prime Minister of Italy. Mussolini and his famous black shirt thugs, they declared a dictatorship in 1925. Mussolini's regime is known for subjecting the Italian people to a hitherto unprecedented level of violence, repression, and civil liberties, and they engaged in the creation of a truly totalitarian state. Class, remember with me your Machiavelli. Earlier, we saw that Machiavelli wanted the state to create fear in the minds of the people and would use cruelty as the means by which fear could be manipulated. This is Mussolini's tactic. Mussolini wanted to compete with the other European states as a colonial power, and in 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia. He makes Haile Selassie flee the country. In 1936, Mussolini joins the Spanish Civil War on the side of Francisco Franco, who we'll talk about in a second. And in 1936, Mussolini committed the state to the Rome-Berlin axis, joining himself to Hitler's cause. Now, let's think about Hitler for a moment, perhaps the most famous fascist of them all. It is likely that no other human being in world history is as despised and feared as Adolf Hitler. During the 12 years of his leadership of the Third Reich, using personal charisma and raw power, Hitler is able to enthrall millions of Germans who listen to his speeches in a raptured state. This as he killed millions of people. At the height of his power, Hitler controlled most of Europe and Western Russia. Hitler was a depraved leader, and he led a depraved state. We're talking about over 100 concentration camps. The brutal attempted genocide of Black people, Jews, Gypsies, gays, and the Slavic people. The fascist state under Hitler is one that demanded people comply with the rules or be slaughtered. In the words of some historians, they regard Hitler's 12 years of power as when the gutter came to power. Here is P.W. Botha, the apartheid South African fascist. From 1978 through 1989, Botha was the leader of apartheid South Africa, and under his rule, a land of about 40 million people, depending on the decade that you're looking at, the land of about 40 million people, 90% of which were Black or designated colored. These people were subjugated by whites who were less than 99% of the country, less than 9% of the country. The nature of the subjugation is called apartheid, and this is a system of segregation or apartness, and this excluded all people who were not white from all the organs of power. Apartheid was a regime that guaranteed and entrenched white minority rule and allowed for the unbridled, unrestrained, terroristic oppression of the Black population. Under the regime of Botha, racism, and a brand of anti-communism became state policy, leading people like Nelson Mandela and the Honorable Winnie Mandela to oppose the apartheid regime. Okay. Now, lastly, for our purposes and for this recording, let's consider Francisco Franco. From 1936 until his death in 1975, Franco was the head of Spain. As an early leader, Francisco Franco allied himself with both Hitler and Mussolini. However, he was able to outlive and survive both of them because Franco knew how to land ideological support, but at the same time, he also knew how to avoid militaristic and diplomatic adventurism, the same of which would lead Hitler to suicide at the conclusion of World War II and would lead Mussolini to be publicly hanged. Francisco Franco's governments were unlike Nazi Germany in that Franco was able to link his state into a more conservative as opposed to a more revolutionary forces of the country. With Franco, we see authoritarianism linked to modernization. We see Franco attempt to adopt various changes in his country as long as they do not challenge his authority. And under Francisco Franco, we see a fascism that is institutionalized, that with authoritarianism, that is limiting pluralism. And by 1953, Francisco Franco's fascist Spain was able to join the world community in the fight against Russian communists. All right, so we'll pause this recording here and we'll continue again. Thank you for your attention.